Well, last evening, my mother called and wanted to talk about the big wedding yesterday. You probably heard about it. It's down in Georgia, my cousin Leroy. I couldn't tell, the connection wasn't clear. I couldn't tell if she said it was his third marriage or he married his third cousin, but either way, she's real excited. Now, you may have been thinking about a different wedding, right? Yeah, how many of you, let's see, show of hands, how many of you watched the wedding yesterday morning? Yeah, there's a number of you. Okay, my wife did. She gave me a full report. Sounds like it's a lot of high fashion and some changes to the traditional ceremony. A lot of fun if you watched it. Listen, that was yesterday's big news. So today we'll shift gears, and let me give you the big news for today, and that is this. It's the message that Jesus spoke to the seven churches. That's our good news for today. We're in a series where we're looking at the seven churches of the book of Revelation, looking at the message Jesus gives to each church. We're on church number 2 today, Church of Smyrna, a faithful church. Our text is Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. Now, last time I talked about the church of Ephesus. The city of Ephesus was the big city, and this was the big church in the big city. And the way Jesus spoke to them was they were doing things right. Oh, so many different areas that they just had it right, except one thing, just one little thing. They were lacking in brotherly love. They were lacking in the love that pulls a church together like a family. And he said, you need to repent, work on that. Now, that's the church of Ephesus. Now we shift gears to a different church, a totally different situation. Sometimes when we see these names in the Bible, names of people, names of places, they're just names to us. I want you to see them as the real things that they were. I want you to see 7 real churches in real life circumstances, and that's why I'm taking the time to describe to you these churches and the place where these people lived. So you can identify with the churches and identify with the message that Jesus speaks to each church. So let's take a look then at Smyrna. First, let me tell you about the city of Smyrna. It was in what we today call Turkey. Back then it was called Asia Minor. It's on the west coast of Turkey. And I want you to notice that both Ephesus and Smyrna are near each other. They're about 35 miles distance. It's 35 miles north of Ephesus. They both have a big harbor. They're both seaport towns. Now, this is where they will both do the same kind of businesses, catering to those who bring in the ships with goods and supplies and passengers. Likewise, they'll both do the fishing business, things of that sort. So the two cities have a lot in common. Now, the difference is in their size. So, for example, Ephesus is the biggest city of the 7 cities. It numbered about 250,000 into the first century. Smyrna is a significant little city, but it's smaller, 100,000. Now, these two cities, situated side by side, were in strong competition. Each city was trying to get businesses to come their way. You need to set up your shop in our city. It's a better place for business, better place to raise your family. And so archaeologists have uncovered some of the competition that went on between these two cities. You know how modern day cities will often make up nicknames to describe themselves, promote themselves? The Big Apple for New York, the Windy City for Chicago. What we found is that Smyrna would market itself as the most beautiful city in Asia. Who says so? They did. But you can say anything about your city as you promote it. So they did. We're the most beautiful city in Asia. And so they would try to interest businesses in coming there. You don't want to get caught up in all the mess that's down there in that big city of Ephesus and all the problems that go with the big cities. Come to our city. Beautiful area, nice place to run a business, nice place to raise a family. And so the two cities competed with one another. Now, who won that competition? Well, I'll tell you what happened. I mentioned last time that Ephesus was often hit by earthquakes, so much so they finally relocated the city around the mountain and put it somewhere else. There's a modern city there today, they call it Selkirk, and it runs from that 250,000 down to about 30,000. It's diminished in size. Now, on the other hand, Smyrna has continued to grow there on the harbor, and so that 100,000 today in the modern city of Izmir, it's about 4.2 million. So Smyrna won that competition. They became the great city on the coast in that region of Turkey. Now, if you go there today looking for ruins, as I did, you're not going to find much that you get to see. I only have 2 slides to show you because there's not much they can show you. They haven't done much digging around. They've taken a little bit of the stones and stacked them up. They could show you maybe an archway here or there. Or they can show you a row of columns so that you can once again get the feel of the city that once was there, but that's about it. Now, the reason they can't show you much is because, well, Smyrna became this big modern city. And it's on top of the ancient city, and they're not going to move out of the way so you can dig up the old city. And so they just devote a little piece of land here and there, and they do some digging. So not a whole lot to see if you go there. But let me describe a little bit more about the city of Smyrna. One of the things that's significant about the city of Smyrna back in the first century was it was extremely loyal to Rome. In fact, the loyalty to Rome began before Rome was a world power. You can go back to the 2nd century BC, and Smyrna already had allegiance towards Rome. Now, in those days, this area of the world, Asia Minor, would have been heavily influenced by Greek and Persian culture. But Rome represented a new culture, a more modern way of looking at things, and from their perspective, they were attracted to Roman culture. And thus already the alliance with Rome was beginning. When Rome became a power and became the Roman Empire and conquered this area, Smyrna was already on board. And thus Smyrna was a very loyal city to all things Rome. Now that's going to play into our message a little bit later. I'll show you that. Another thing about the city of Smyrna, large Jewish community. Now back in those ancient times, it was a lot then like it is today. Not everybody liked the Jews. And so it was, as the Jews would migrate throughout the world, they would sometimes come to a city that was not giving them a friendly reception, very hostile. They oftentimes decided to keep moving. A few might settle in, but most would just keep on moving until they found a city that welcomed them. Now, to give you an example from the New Testament times, in Acts chapter 18, when Claudius became the emperor of the Roman Empire, he didn't like Jews. So he issued an edict that Jews would be banned from the city of Rome. And so that's when Jews had to leave the city. That's when Acts 18 tells us Aquila and Priscilla left Rome, took their business to Corinth, and that's where they met Paul and did business with Paul and did ministry with Paul. You see, that would often happen to the Jews. They'd get to an area that didn't welcome them. But Smyrna welcomed the Jews, and thus Smyrna had a large Jewish community. As a community outnumbered the church, and that's going to figure into our message as I show you in just a moment. I'll tell you one more historical note about the city of Smyrna. That's something they bragged about. They claimed to be the home of Homer. Remember in literature class, the Iliad, the Odyssey, those great epic poems that were written by Homer? Homer goes back to before the time of Isaiah, about a century before, and he was one of the most famous writers from the ancient times. Everybody knew about the Iliad and the Odyssey and some of the other things that he wrote. Well, they claimed he was born and raised here in Smyrna. That was their claim to fame. Well, there's more I could tell you about the city of Smyrna, but let me move to the church of Smyrna. Now, outside the book of Revelation, the New Testament doesn't mention this church. We know nothing about them from New Testament times. Now, in church history, we got just a little bit more because just a few years later after the Apostle John, about the year 115 AD, we have a church leader by the name of Ignatius. And Ignatius will send an epistle to the church of Smyrna, his letter to the Smyrnians. Also, about that same time, he'll send a letter to the leader of the church of Smyrna, a man named Polycarp, and thus he addresses his epistle to Polycarp, the bishop of the church of Smyrna. Also, about that same time, Polycarp himself will send a letter to the church of Philippi, his letter to the Philippians from Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna. And one more piece of literature written by someone we don't know who, but he wrote the martyrdom of Polycarp. You know, in the early church, Polycarp was the most famous Christian martyr. Now, in the New Testament times, Stephen was our first Christian martyr there in the book of Acts, and I preached a sermon on Stephen a little bit earlier this year. But now we're talking about outside of the New Testament period. And outside of the New Testament period, Polycarp became the most famous of the Christian martyrs. His story is told in this martyrdom of Polycarp and some other places as well. And they took him and they tied him to a stake. They burned him alive and this and that. And so it is, the church of Smyrna did have a certain amount of significance in the New Testament times and in church history. Now, Jesus is ready to speak a message to the church of Smyrna. He begins in verse 8, just like he does in all 7 of the messages. First, he identifies to whom he's speaking. He says, so to the angel of the church of Smyrna, write these words. And then he identifies himself, the one who's doing the talking. He always does it with a very creative phrase. He says, these are the words of the one who's the first and the last, the one who died and then came back to life. And every time that Jesus describes himself with some creative phrase, he will later use that in the message he speaks to that church. I'll show it to you later. Now, what's he want to say to the church of Smyrna? Well, first, he wants to talk about their faith, how their faith has been tested. Now, he describes their faith tested by two words. He speaks of affliction and poverty. Verse 9, he says, I know about your affliction. I know about your poverty. Now, those two words are describing what was happening with the church of Smyrna and the Roman authorities. They were being persecuted by Rome. Now, let me tell you a little bit about first century persecution from Rome. In the first 30 years of the church's history, Rome left us alone. You can read the book of Acts. It covers the first 30 years. And our problem was not Rome. Our problem was the Jews. The same Jewish leaders who took Jesus and had him crucified are also the Jewish leaders who came after the church. They're the ones who will take Stephen and stone him to death, take the apostles and put them in prison. They'll go after Paul. They'll go after Peter. You see, our troubles for the first 30 years were dealing with our Jewish opposition. Now, Rome was neutral towards us, didn't care. In fact, Paul used his Roman citizenship to his advantage. There was an occasion where Paul was arguing with the Pharisees. It became loud, and so the Roman soldiers come in to restore peace, and as they often did in restoring peace, you just grab the loudest people, the ones who look like they're causing the trouble, and sometimes what they do is just give them a good beating and then send them on their way, and that would teach them a lesson. Got ready to give Paul a good beating, and Paul said, is that legal to do to a Roman citizen? And they said, what do you mean Roman citizen? I thought you were Jewish. Oh, I am, but I was born in the Roman city of Tarsus. I'm a Roman citizen. Well, they couldn't give him a beating like that. He used his Roman citizenship when it was advantageous. You see, Rome wasn't the problem in the first 30 years. But in the 60s, Rome became a problem for the church because that was the period of the Emperor Nero. Now, if you know the story of Nero, you may also know that Nero was ambitious like all emperors were, and he wanted to leave a legacy in Rome, and the legacy he had in mind was a section of Rome that was old and run down. Property values were diminished. The poor people lived there. He wanted to evict the poor and tear it all down and then rebuild and put up a fancy new section there. The Senate didn't agree with him. Thought it's too much money, didn't think the treasury could afford it at this time. And so, lo and behold, what a coincidence. That section of the city burnt down. It caught on fire. Now, of course, the rumors began immediately because everybody knew what was going on here. Nero had hired people to burn that part of the city so he could then do the building project he wanted to do and of course, leave his legacy there for Rome. Now, he needed somebody to blame, a scapegoat, so he blamed the Christians. Nero started this idea that the Christians did this. They're always talking about their leader, Jesus. When he comes, he's going to bring fire, and they're going to burn cities and tear down governments. They're a threat to our society, a threat to our welfare and being, and we need to do something about those Christians. And thus Nero will issue an edict of persecution against the church. Now, after Nero's gone, the next several emperors didn't much care about Christianity. That wasn't an issue for them. And so the persecution fades away until the 90s, the time when John's writing the book of Revelation. Domitian takes the throne, and Domitian will issue an edict of persecution, but for a different reason. Domitian was more of a traditionalist. He valued the ancient Roman religions, the things they taught, the things they stood for, their principles, their values. And he didn't like Christianity opposing the old religions. Because Christian preachers would say, hey, the religions are false. The gods are false. You need to come to Jesus Christ, the Savior, the Lord. Come to the church. And so he thought of the church as a threat to something he valued. And so he went after Christians, issued an edict of persecution for them. Now, here's the way edicts of persecutions would work all through the first several centuries of the church. If Rome said that Christianity is illegal and to be persecuted is to be dealt with, each city would take that edict and do what they thought best. Sometimes you get to an area of the Roman Empire where they actually liked the Christians. They were good neighbors, good citizens, good businessmen. They'd just ignore the rules. Others, however, would enforce the rules because Rome said so you got to do what you're told. Smyrna would be an example of a city that's going to do what Rome says. Of the 7 cities of Asia Minor, the 7 cities of the book of Revelation, it's going to be Smyrna that's going to do the persecution that's called for because that's just Smyrna. They're loyal to Rome. And so it is, if you're a Christian living in the church of Smyrna there in that city, you got some hard times. You got affliction and poverty. Now, the word affliction picks up on physical mistreatment. That would cover such things as beatings, as well as being thrown into prison. Or it would also even cover death, such as being tied to a stake and burned, like Polycarp. Or thrown to the lions in the Colosseum. You see, that would cover the physical harm. Poverty would cover the other thing they did to Christians, put financial burdens on them, put a heavy fine, or confiscate property, thinking that if I touch your money, that'll change your mind about things. And so it is, the church of Smyrna is facing affliction and poverty because they stand up for the name of Christ. They're Christians in a difficult city. Now, their problem isn't just with Rome, though, because he also speaks about opposition and slander. He says in verse 9, I know about the slander. I know about those who slander you, who say they're Jews, but they're not. They're a synagogue of Satan. Now, what's he talking about here is the same problem that the church had all through the first century, the opposition with the Jews. See, that started from day one when they opposed Jesus, and it went all through the book of Acts. It continued through that first century. If there was a Jewish majority in a town and a Christian minority, the church would often suffer as these two were in conflict. And the suffering would sometimes lead to something like the stoning of Stephen and some of the other things that you see in the New Testament writings. And so it is, this church is facing opposition from the Jewish majority. Now, he speaks about slander. They're slandering you. What are they saying about the church that was bad? It's not what Nero was saying. No, it's something different. The argument here is, who is the real people of God? Now, Israel's saying, we're the people of God. We were the chosen back in the days of Abraham. We're the chosen people. We're Israel. We're the Jews. We're the people of God. What the church was preaching is, no, we're the people of God. See, that's the message you'll see Paul preaching in his writings and Peter in his writings. That it's those who put their faith in Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament promises, as the Messiah, the Christ, the Savior, the Lord. Those who believe in Jesus, you're the people of God. You see, you're the true Israel, as Paul will say. You're the true circumcision. You're the true children of Abraham. It's not by race. It's not by blood. It's by faith in the Word of God as it's expressed in Jesus Christ. That's what makes you the people of God. So we have Jews and Christians arguing over who's the real people of God. You know what Jesus says about it? They say they're Jews. I say they're not. See, it's the church that stands for Jesus. It's the church that he puts his praise upon. Now, he speaks of the Jews who oppose the church and oppose him. He calls them a synagogue of Satan. That's what he says in verse 9. He says, they say they're Jews, I say not. I say they're a synagogue of Satan. Now, strong language, I caution you, don't get very strong in your language, even against people that are wrong. Jesus has divine authority. He could say what he wants. You and I have been taught to stand up for what is true and stand up against that which is false, but do it with a little bit of grace and love as we do so, to be charitable. Spoke about that last week. But Jesus speaks very strong words here. He speaks of the Jewish people who are opposing the church as a synagogue of Satan. Put that in a modern context you might appreciate. Suppose we had a Church of Christ somewhere that was forsaking good Bible doctrine, moving away from the Scriptures, teaching things that are contrary to what God's Word said, practicing things that are contrary to what the Scriptures teach us to do. They've moved far astray from what the church is supposed to be. If Jesus wrote 7 messages today, he might say to that church, you call yourself a church of Christ, I call you a church of the devil. That's what he's doing with the Jews. You say you're a synagogue of the Lord, and yet you don't recognize me. You don't recognize my people. You're not a synagogue of the Lord. You're a synagogue of Satan. Now, I want you to know something about that word synagogue, because that relates to what was going on in the first century. As the Jews opposed the Christians, they faced them with several different options. Like Stephen, they stoned to death. Others, they did this or that. One of the things they did to a lot of the Christians was they expelled you from the synagogues. See, a lot of those early Christians were also Jews. They were born and raised Jews, and then they converted to Christ, but they still were Jewish by race. And their families and friends were Jews, so they would go to the synagogues to visit their families and evangelize. They'd go to their homes. And what they would do is expel them from the synagogues and also tell the families, don't welcome into your families. They would push them out, ban them. What Jesus says is, I know you've been banned from their synagogue, but you belong to me. You're my people. Well, they've got trouble coming from two different directions. They've got the Roman authorities and they've got the Jewish authorities, and they're all coming after the little church of Smyrna. It's not easy to be a Christian in the town of Smyrna. I have to tell you something else here. He says, you're spiritually rich. I like the way he put it. He said, I know about your affliction. I know about your poverty, and yet you're rich. Now, not rich in material wealth because the Roman authorities were confiscating their properties. Not rich in numbers because they're outnumbered by the Jews and by the Romans, but they're rich in faith, in spirit. Because this is a church that's being tested by persecution, and being tested has made them strong. They probably had some who've fallen by the wayside and quit, but those who remained have become stronger in faith, stronger in spirit. He says, oh, I know about affliction, I know about poverty, but I'm looking at the real you, and you are spiritually rich. Boy, that's a good commendation for this church. What else does Jesus want to say to the church of Smyrna? Well, he wants to talk about their troubles. They got more troubles to come. I mean, if you thought it's been bad so far, you haven't seen everything yet. There's more days of persecution on the way. He says in verse 10, I don't want you to be afraid. Don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer, because the devil is going to take some of you and throw you into prison to test you. He says, you've got 10 days of persecution that's coming. 10 days of persecution. Boy, there's more trouble coming. Now, if you're doing the math thinking, okay, wait a minute, 10 more days of persecution and it's all over, a week and a half, they can tough it out and they'll be done. No, you're misunderstanding. Because when you're reading books of prophecy, like the book of Revelation or the Old Testament prophets, numbers have symbolic value. And the number 10 is the number for fullness and completeness, a full measure of something, not a partial, but a full. How much persecution is Smyrna going to dump on the church? Oh, not just a few days. They're going to get the whole measure. That's what the 10 days symbolizes. See, Smyrna is that city that's extremely loyal to Rome. And if the emperor of Rome says that the church is a threat to our society and our way of life and they need to be dealt with, Smyrna will be the first one and the last when it's all over. They're going to put the full measure of persecution on the church. That's what he's warning this church. You've got more to come. It's going to get much worse before it ever gets better in your town. It's not a good place to live if you're a Christian. In fact, some may have packed their bags and moved. Maybe moved down to Ephesus. They can still do their business at Ephesus. Ephesus wants them. But some will stay. I know they do. Because they'll tough it out through this period of persecution. When they get done, you'll have a man like Polycarp leading the church of Smyrna. You'll have a church that's still thriving, even in the midst of persecution. Well, that's how he describes the church of Smyrna. They're facing more persecution ahead, but then he talks about the crown of life. Verse 10, be faithful. Be faithful unto death, and I'll give you the crown of life. Those are words you should memorize. That's a good memory verse for today. Be faithful unto death, I'll give you the crown of life. Revelation 2:10. Now, what he describes there is very significant when you understand the wording. It's the Greek word Stephanos. That's the kind of crown he's talking about here, the victory crown. The victory crown is the Greek word Stephanos. It's different from a king's crown, which represents authority. The Stephanos crown is the victory crown. It means I won. So, example, if you're running in the Olympics and you cross the finish line, the guy that crosses first, they put the Stephanos crown on his head, the victory crown, because he's the winner. A general who leads his army into battle and wins a great victory, as he's riding back home in victory, he'll wear the Stephanos crown. The victory crown, that's what Stephanos means. And so it is if you are victorious. If you stay faithful till the very end, I'm going to give you the victory crown, the crown of life. I've mentioned to you before that my entertainment is I run marathons, the 26.2 miles marathon. I enjoy the long distance run. Now, in younger days, a lot of guys will enjoy the shorter races where you can sprint, try to beat all the other guys. I never was that fast to begin with. I'm certainly not there now. And that's why the older you get, the more it's advantageous to switch to the long distance racing. Because with long distance racing, it's not about trying to beat somebody. It's about finishing the distance, crossing the finish line. Because in long distance racing, everybody who crosses the finish line gets a finisher's medal. I've got a collection of the marathon medals I've gotten. And not because I'm fast, but because I finished to the end, and everybody, no matter what your time, everybody gets a finisher's medal. You know, the Christian life is not a sprint. It's more like a long distance run. and all ages and all strengths and all abilities. We run this thing and we finish at different times, but everyone who finishes and crosses the line gets the victory crown. You get the Stephanos. We all win if you finish. That's what he's saying to the church. He's saying you've got hard times and it's going to get worse. More hard times to come. But if you're faithful unto death, I'll give you the crown of life. Which brings up something else Jesus is talking about in this passage, death and resurrection. He's telling this church, you're a tough place to be a church because you've got the Jews and the Romans coming after you. And it's going to be physical. It's going to hurt. In fact, some of you will die. But notice who's doing the talking here. It's the same person who way back when had the Jews persecuting him, opposing him as he tried to teach in the temple, eventually taking him up on charges to be crucified, and a Roman governor who issued the order to have him crucified. See, Jesus has dealt with a hostile environment. He dealt with the Jews and the Romans, and he died on a cross. And that's the one that speaks to the church of Smyrna and says, I know where you are. I know where you live because I've been there. And they killed Jesus, but then remember how he identified himself back in verse 8? But these are the words of the one who is the first and the last. I was dead, I died, but then I came back to life again. And now he offers to this church the crown of life. If they were to take you and kill you, I'll give you the crown of life and you'll live forever in heaven. You see, this is the promise he gives to this church of Smyrna. Church of Smyrna is a good church. There's no rebuke here. There's no criticism. There's no wrong they need to repent of. No, it's just a good, strong church being faithful to Christ. And he encourages them just to remain faithful. And then he closes with a heavenly hope. All 7 messages in the same way, just a word of hope and encouragement to each church. And it always starts with these words to whoever has ears. I want you to listen to what the Spirit says to the 7 churches. Listen to each message and see if you can learn a lesson from each message. That's what you and I are doing. And then he always says to the one who overcomes. He always speaks to all of us who will tough it out and overcome. We stay faithful and true to the finish line, to those who overcome, and then he offers you a promise. In this case, the promise, you'll not be hurt by the second death. That's the promise here. He says, if you will overcome, you will not be hurt by the second death. Now, you know what the first death is because every one of us knows that day's coming when our body ceases to function. No more breathing, no more heartbeat, we're dead. But there's a second death too. Jesus talked about it in the Gospel of Luke. Gospel of Luke, he says, don't be afraid of those who can take your body and kill it, but then can't do anything to you after that. No. You need to be concerned about the one who, after your body is dead, he can still take you and cast you into hell, and that's the death after death. That's the second death. The promise to the church of Smyrna is this: if you're faithful, if you overcome all the opposition that comes your way, you don't have to worry about that second death. That's not going to happen to you because you're going to get the crown of life. That's the message that Jesus gives to the church. It's the message he has for us as well today. And what a message that can be in the modern church. Think about a church in this world that's being persecuted. Not here, but there are places. We support a mission in India. And every so often you hear the news story of an Indian preacher, someone in the church, that the Hindu majority, the extremists, will take them and kill them. This message to Smyrna speaks to them that no matter what they do to you, I'll give you the crown of life. I think of a different kind of opposition that we know so well, cultural opposition. We're living in a modern culture that mocks Christianity and our commitment to the Scriptures, the believing the stories of the Bible, the values of the Bible. They've moved on to something different, and they oppose us and harass us over our beliefs. It's not quite the same as what Christians face under persecution, but it's a challenge to be faithful and true and stand for your convictions. Stand for what you believe in and don't be ashamed to say it out loud to people. That's what you do if you're faithful until death. You want that crown of life. I think my real concern, though, about the modern day church is that not much is happening to us. Certainly in an area like Eastern North Carolina, you can be a Christian, say it out loud, nobody seems to care. But, sometimes when nobody cares and nobody's pushing back, sometimes we become a little bit lax, a little bit complacent, a little bit of apathy sets in. Our Christian fervor not quite as strong as it should be as we just coast along. I'm concerned about that. That's why I push you every week. I got to be the guy that pushes you if nobody else does, because I want you to be strong. You see, a church that's tested, like the church of Smyrna, where their faith is tested, it just makes them stronger. They grow and become spiritually rich, and I wonder how spiritually rich we are if things are so easy for us sometimes. And so it is, we've got to take this to heart as well, to be faithful. To be faithful every day until the day we die, because we know the promise. We know the promise that if you're faithful unto death, then you get the crown of life. Because that's the message that Jesus says to the church of Smyrna. That's the message for the church today.